Welcome to episode 45 of Creative Walks. And today I wanted to talk about a very curious subject, which is the stories we tell ourselves and how they relate to our confidence levels. If you remember in episode 43, I think, I talked a little bit about this idea of an unusual autobiography, which was the self-portrait as a city map, and where all those influences and all those things that you built and twists and turns in your life are represented metaphorically in a map. And I think there is a lot of benefits in rethinking how you view your own story in a more literal way. Like a lot of very successful people, think of someone that you admire, they usually say that there was this moment in their lives where they had like hard times or they didn't want to keep going, and the thing that got them through was the support of one or two like key people that believed in them when they had their own doubts about themselves. And I think it's because we often focus on the more mundane aspects of our lives or the things that are our shortcomings, and we compare the life that we wish we had had with the one that we actually have. And it's a very common thing in psychology that we tend to count losses more heavily than the wins, right? We forget the stuff that we achieved very quickly compared to the things that we lost. It's a very human thing. And I think that for sure is something that makes us keep us down. It's like we are imprisoned by the stories that we tell ourselves, or at least the stories that we think in our heads, but we never externalize, which is one of the advantages of actually doing a diary, for example, having a journal of some sort. But I think those stories, they can also be liberating when you do them appropriately, because those people, for example, that believed in us when we didn't believe in ourselves, they were seeing things that we sometimes cannot see. They see potential for sure, but they see some things that for them are amazing, but you got accustomed to, and you don't see them how great they are. And I think we all have those things. And if you think you don't, it's probably because you haven't thought of your story in a more bigger, epic way. So just to give a small example, I have a few friends in Brazil where I lived most of my life, or at least a big part of my life, and they were I was for a while, very unsatisfied in their job. I used to work in the Brazilian government, and I had some friends that are still there, or they still live in the small town and they never left. And I remember a few times when I came back home and I was feeling bad because I felt so far behind in my career compared to where I wanted to be. And I was comparing to where those friends that stayed there, where they were. And it seemed to me that they were in a great place. Sometimes they had at least in material terms, they had a great house, they had job security, they had gone up the corporate ladder, or they started their own businesses and things like that. But when you go have some beers and start talking, they start telling how frustrated they were with their jobs, or miserable in their relationships and so on, and how they admired me for dropping the job that I could basically have for life and go on this very uncertain path of being a photographer or musician. And I never really thought of that as a virtue. It was just something that I did. Or even when people told me, even things that, oh wow, you actually started a band, or you actually did a whole fine art series of photographs. And to me, those things were just things that I had done. And I tended to focus on all the things that didn't live up to my standards, to the dreams, rather than what actually happened, because they, of course, became the norm. Well, a couple of days ago, my wife, who hosts her own podcast about belly dance, she decided to interview me for her show because I had done a lot of work in Arabic music and belly dance photography, and she thought it would be fun to have me on the show. So it was interesting because I went on this little memory lane that I often don't go to, which is like my journey in Arabic music and discovering a lot of things in that subject, and how I started doing photos of belly dancers, which actually led to the creation of some fine art series and all that. And it actually gave me a lot of insights that I haven't had before. And I was not expecting that I would like learn anything new from revisiting parts of my own story. And that got me thinking about the subject of today's podcast, which is the stories we tell ourselves, but from a very specific point of view, which is I got reminded of this book by Paulo Coelho, a Brazilian writer that everybody knows, in his book, The Alchemist. And this concept that he used often on his writing, which is how you follow your personal legend. He calls this lenda pessoal, which means exactly that, like your personal legend. And that relates to this idea of this understanding on even mythical terms of your story. And I thought how that related to a bunch of other things that are interesting to me, specifically how, for example, Joseph Campbell, which I mentioned before about the hero's journey and how it relates to the artist's journey, and how he calls this thing that Paulo Coelho calls your personal legend, how he calls following your bliss. And there's a lot of misconceptions about following your bliss, as in, when you find your dream job, you'll never have to work in your life. And that's absolutely not true. But it's this idea that those things that really click on your personality that you really need to chase. And that could be, it not necessarily works in art. It could be any kind of longings we have that we are not pursuing. And that's how, like in the case of Paulo Coelho, he relates to the idea of your personal legend. And I think you don't really need to wait for people to ask you your story. You can always start telling it. And that also reminded me of another related inspirational idea. This is a little bit more like practical, but I think it's very powerful. It's the idea from Joe Rogan that he said, I think it's a video, if you search on YouTube, it will be the hero of your own movie. And the idea is like, imagine that if your life was a movie and you're the hero, what would you do? So it's this idea that sometimes we see our lives as this mundane thing, or we haven't achieved this or that. And the way that I see it is like as if you are in the first step in the hero's journey that we mentioned before, the ordinary world, right? You are in this thing that is very familiar, but there's something wrong and you want to go somewhere. You have this itch of some sort of personal exploration. And the way he mentions is like, okay, you were a loser your whole life, or you feel that way, and how can you lift yourself out of that? You become the hero in your own story, which is, I think it's something that in a more metaphysical way, Paulo Coelho and Joseph Campbell talk about. And I think that's very useful and very interesting, because one of the things that happens when you start writing down or speaking on the microphone your story is that something that I think Steve Jobs said, that you can't connect the dots moving forward, only looking backwards. And that's something that like happened to me literally like live on air, so to speak, during this podcast, because I was never really sure of why I was interested in like belly dance and in Arabic music. And a very deep answer came from that when Yana asked me specifically like, oh, people say like you're like Brazilian guy, why are you interested in Arabic music? And then that actually unlocked the answer. And it's very much related to my current interests in ethnic fashion, in this connection of world cultures, and also like some elements that I haven't really explored explicitly, but which is like powerful female figures in my works of art. But they are very, very much connected. And whenever that episode comes out, I would urge you to go check it out. But today, I actually wanted to mention this concept of rethinking your life story. And I think that's like, if you're an artist, that will be very useful if you are like rethinking, rewriting your artist statement. For people that don't know, it's very common for especially visual artists to have something called an artist statement. It's usually like a paragraph or a page where you talk about your influences, the meanings in your work, your motivations, the relevance of your work, and so on. That's usually a pain in the ass to write as an artist, because, at least to me, it always felt like artificial and phony, or at least it looked like a mask to the real art. And it also feels, at least to me, always felt like I got better with the time talking about my work, but I always felt a little bit fake, a little bit like you are a comedian explaining your joke. And I think it was even Joseph Campbell that said that if you want to insult an artist, ask him what his art means. And he wants to insult you, he will tell you. And of course, that's a little bit like on the cheeky side, a little bit too simplistic, because I think the story of the artist is very much a part of the art itself. And I think there's this quote that said that the universe is made of stories, not atoms. And I think that applies to art too, and I think that applies to our story. And at the same time, we are so like drawn to this artists that do have a vision and that they do know how to express it. And at least when people talk about their artworks, they talk about this vision and this drive. And of course, we all have this vision of being this articulate artist and creating things that are relevant to our point of view in the world. We admire this artist with a clear vision, a purpose. And I think by creating your own life story and writing it and being very real about where you are and about where you want to go, it will help unlock a lot of things, including writing a better artist statement that doesn't sound phony and doesn't like read as a boring like postmodern thing. So that's my suggestion for today. Like, and of course, if you don't have a complete vision of where you want to be, or if you think your life is not interesting or whatever like you're thinking, don't worry, those things will come. But I think even if the path looks very foggy and very uncertain, there is like, that's a hint for you to go and make more art. And if you were blocked, or if you think that like whatever thing is related to the unspoken tragedy of the mundane, right? This idea that it's okay to have tragedies, but if you have something that is very like pedestrian, mundane, for some reason that sounds like it's not a worthy story. And I think that's one of the most difficult things that we have in today's world, that most people, at least not necessarily most people, but a lot of people are like, they're not fighting for survival. They're not really going after tigers or dying of malaria or things like that, like at least in the developed world. But so as artists, we kind of feel phony on our tragedies. They're not real tragedies, right? It's like very first world problems, especially when you think of procrastination or things like that. But at the same time, it is very much a real trap. And you can always incorporate that element, like, oh, how simple my life is, in part of your life story. And that can at least put you in the ordinary world part of your life. And I think that could be like an interesting exercise. So my advice is like, literally write it down, or get your phone and record in your own voice telling the story, even if you're not going to share it with anyone. I think when you literally speak the words, a lot of things will sound true to you. They will serve as a compass. And until you do, trust me, you do not know what kind of treasures are hidden in this unspoken personal legend. So if you do it, let me know how it goes. My name again is Pedro Bonatto. If you're new to the show, there is a lot of talk about art and art inspiration and all that. So if you think there are friends of yours that would benefit from listening to artistic struggles from a working artist, just go and share with them. That would mean the world to me. And in any case, I will talk to you tomorrow. I hope you enjoyed this little exploration of personal legends.